The people of Hollow Creek still remember the night the shadow first appeared on the ridge. It was the spring of 1976, just after a rainstorm that had soaked the valley for 2 days. The earth was slick with mud, carrying the scent of wet soil, grass crushed under boots, and the metallic bite of storm clouds that refused to leave. Mist rose like pale serpents across the hills, curling in and out of the trees, hiding and revealing the land with each movement of the wind. If you enjoy this kind of story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next chilling tale. Your support helps us keep bringing more stories like this one. At the very top of the ridge, under the swollen silver moon, stood a woman in white. Thin as a scarecrow, her bones sharp beneath her skin, she was motionless, as though carved from stone. The hem of her dress swayed even though the air was still, as if it obeyed a breeze that belonged only to her. Her head tilted unnaturally to the side, like a listener leaning closer to secrets carried by the night. Her grin revealed only 3 teeth, long and yellowed, catching the moonlight like ivory shards. And some swore they heard it, the brittle clack of those teeth grinding, as though chewing something far too hard to be food. It was not the sound of bread or meat being torn. It was the sound of bone. From that moment forward, the whispers of the town gave her a name that would never fade: the witch who never died. Hollow Creek was a forgotten town, tucked away in a valley where the modern world rarely reached. Wooden houses with peeling paint lined the dirt road, a single chapel bell tolled on Sundays, and the general store doubled as the place for gossip, barter, and warnings that sounded like jokes until night fell. The land seemed eternal. Rolling meadows of golden grass bent under the wind, oak trees reached toward the heavens with branches twisted like claws, and streams shone like silver ribbons whenever the sun cut through the clouds. And always, high above them, was the hill. On its peak stood a crooked clay and wood house, its roof sagging with age, its door warped by storms. It seemed to lean forward, watching the valley below like a silent sentinel. That house belonged to Miss Agatha Crowe, the oldest soul anyone had ever known. No one could tell her age. Some whispered she was over 100. Others claimed she had been old when their grandparents were still children. She never gave a straight answer. Instead, she would smile with her 3 teeth, her voice a rasp of dried leaves. I lost count long ago. Children were warned never to stray near her hill after sunset. Women made the sign of the cross when her name was spoken. Men lowered their voices when gossip turned to her. For Agatha was a healer, yes, but something more, something older. She knew every herb, every poisonous root, every leaf that could mend or kill. Her teas cured fevers, her salves closed wounds, yet some swore she could rot an entire field with a whispered curse, summon storms with a chant, or lure men into the forest where their bones were never found. And on nights when the moon was fat and white, travelers claimed to see her, naked and dancing among the shadows, fireflies swirling like stars around her as though the forest itself bowed to her steps. Fear was her true companion, and fear kept the town. The balance of Hollow Creek shattered the day the Harrisons arrived. Edward Harrison, broad-shouldered and stubborn, had left the city behind in search of fertile soil and peace. Margaret, her wife, followed with the quiet devotion of a woman who clung to faith, praying the countryside would heal what the city had broken. Their children, Edward, 16 and restless, and Sarah, 14, curious and bright, looked at the valley with wonder. The land Edward bought lay at the base of Agatha's Hill. It was rich, dark soil, with a creek that promised life and orchards that already bore fruit. Too perfect, sold too cheaply. The previous owner had died suddenly, his face twisted in horror, though doctors had scribbled "heart attack" on the paper. The townsfolk muttered other words: curse, vengeance, retribution, but only when outsiders couldn't hear. Edward drove into town in his rattling Jeep, Margaret smiling proudly beside him, Sarah's laughter carried on the wind. The townsfolk greeted them politely, offered small help, and watched. But on her porch above, Agatha stood in silence. Her pale eyes narrowed. She shook her head slowly, as if she were mourning, or warning, or condemning. When asked about the newcomers later that day, the storekeeper received only one rasped phrase: "They should never have returned." The townsfolk exchanged nervous glances. The Harrisons had never been in Hollow Creek before, or had they? For the first week, all seemed well. Edward plowed the fields, Michael hauled stones from the creek bed, and Sarah chased chickens through the yard. Margaret baked bread and carried it to the neighbors, her laughter softening the wary faces of the villagers. But the land remembers. 2 weeks later, Edward awoke to silence. No clucking, no flutter of wings. He walked to the yard and froze. Every chicken lay dead. Not stolen, not mauled, but placed deliberately in a circle in the center of the yard, each neck twisted in the same cruel fashion. Not one missing, not one spared. Edward stormed into the general store. "Foxes," muttered old Mr. Grant, though he would not meet Edward's eyes. Edward's voice shook with anger. "Foxes don't arrange chickens in circles." The very next day, the family stallion, proud, strong, and worth more than the Jeep Edward drove, was found collapsed in the field. No wounds, no struggle, simply lifeless. Margaret pressed her rosary into her palm until it cut the skin. Something in her heart whispered that this was only the beginning. And then, as the nights grew longer, the moon waxed full. She showed herself. It was Margaret who saw her first. She awoke to faint footsteps outside, measured, deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. She crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside with trembling fingers. In the yard, drenched in moonlight, stood a figure in white, thin, still, watching. Even from that distance, Margaret knew the crooked posture, the tangled hair, the pale grin. Miss Agatha Crowe. But something was different. She looked taller, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground as though it sought to touch the house. Around her ankles, darkness writhed, shapes that slithered like serpents, though the yard was empty. Margaret's breath caught. She clutched her chest, certain she could feel those hollow eyes on her. "Edward!" she hissed. Her husband stumbled to the window, but by then, the yard was empty. Morning revealed the true horror. Every crop had been destroyed. Corn stalks yanked from the soil, beans scattered like corpses, potatoes torn out with roots exposed. The land looked as though a war had raged in silence overnight. Edward took his fury to the sheriff in the next town. The man sighed, scribbled notes. Vandals, boys with nothing better to do. Or maybe someone angry you bought that land cheap. But the sheriff's eyes slid away, betraying doubt. Margaret said nothing, but she clutched her rosary harder, her knuckles white. She already knew. The woman in white had come down from the hill. It began with whispers. At first, Margaret thought her daughter was speaking in her sleep. Small, broken words drifting through the cracks of midnight. But soon she realized Sarah was not dreaming. She was sitting awake, eyes wide, staring at corners where no one else dared to look. The girl who once filled the house with laughter had grown silent. Her skin turned pale, her lips cracked, her hair hung limp as though the very color was draining out of her. She ate little, spoke less, and when she did, her words chilled the blood of her parents. "She comes at night," Sarah whispered, voice trembling. "She stands at the end of my bed, just watching. She never blinks. She never leaves until the moon fades." Margaret clutched her child close, tears wetting Sarah's tangled hair. "Who, my darling? Who do you see?" With a trembling hand, Sarah lifted her finger and pointed up the hill. Edward's jaw tightened. His anger gave him courage, but even he shivered when the name passed Sarah's lips. "Agatha," she whispered, as though saying it out loud invited the woman into the room. Desperate, Edward carried Sarah to a city doctor. The man barely looked up from his papers. Stress. The move unsettled her. These things pass. Here. He scribbled a prescription for sedatives. She'll sleep. But sleep did not heal Sarah. The pills dulled her, made her eyes glassy, but her body withered. Her cheeks hollowed, her bones pressed against her skin, and still she woke screaming. Michael, restless and protective of his sister, grew angrier by the day. He stayed out late, loitering with the boys in town, trying to escape the suffocating silence of his home. But one night, as he walked back under the moonlight, he saw something that would haunt him forever. At the crossroads, beneath the twisted oak where old folk left offerings for spirits, a figure knelt in the dirt. Agatha Crowe. Her body was bent, her thin arms shaking as she traced symbols into the soil with a lump of black charcoal. Around her lay bundles of cloth tied with red string, each one pulsing faintly in the moonlight as though something inside them moved. Michael froze. His breath caught in his throat. Agatha's lips moved, murmuring words he could not understand, sharp syllables that sounded older than the hills themselves. The ground seemed to hum with her voice. And then she stopped. Her head turned slowly, impossibly slowly, until her eyes locked with his. Though the night was thick, though the shadows should have hidden him, he felt her stare cut into his soul. Her grin widened, showing those 3 teeth. Michael fled, his legs barely obeying him, his chest burning, sweat soaking his shirt, though the night was cold. When he burst into the house, gasping, he told his father everything. Edward listened in silence, his fists clenching on the table. Finally, he stood. This ends tonight. The oil lamp flickered as Edward loaded his rifle. His hands shook, but his jaw was set. Margaret clung to him, desperation in her eyes. "You don't understand what she is. She's not just an old woman. She's something older, something darker. If you go up that hill, you won't come back." Edward pulled free. "I will not live in fear of some crone with tricks and stories. She's tormenting this family. Tonight, I end it." Michael stepped forward. "Let me come." "No." Edward's voice was steel. "Stay. Protect your mother and sister. If I fail, take them far from here." The words hung heavy, a confession that even he doubted his return. The front door creaked open, and Edward stepped into the night. The damp air smelled of wet soil and smoke. A wolf howled somewhere in the hills. His boots crunched against gravel as he climbed the path toward the crooked house. From the porch, Margaret watched until he vanished into the trees. Her heart sank with every step. Deep inside, she already knew that was the last time she would see her husband alive. Then, behind a heavy cabinet, they found the shrine. Black candles melted into grotesque shapes, bones laid carefully on a stained cloth, tiny bones, unmistakably human, fingers curled as if frozen in agony. Photographs covered the wall, dozens, yellowed and curling. Men, women, families whose faces no one recognized, until one photograph froze them all. It showed a stern man with a thick mustache, his wife beside him, and 3 children standing stiffly in front of a wooden sign. Edward's ancestors, his bloodline. The men fell silent. The land Edward had bought was not just cursed, it was reclaimed. Behind the crooked house, the soil was soft, freshly turned. The men began to dig, their lanterns throwing trembling light across the earth. It did not take long to find the first bones, then more and more. Dozens of skeletons, stacked over decades, some small enough to fit in a single shovel. Children, their bones fragile and delicate. Others still wore scraps of decayed clothing, buckles and rings clinging to rotted flesh. The stench rose thick and choking, a mixture of decomposition and chemicals that burned the nose. One man dropped to his knees, retching into the weeds. Another crossed himself again and again, muttering prayers between sobs. "God have mercy," whispered Mr. Grant. "She's been feeding the earth with bodies." But the horror was not yet complete. A scream tore through the orchard. The men rushed toward the sound, lanterns swinging. There, hanging upside down from the gnarled branches of an ancient oak, was Edward Harrison. His body dangled by the ankles, pale as wax. His throat was slit, but the ground was clean. Beneath him stood a wide wooden trough. It brimmed with dark liquid, nearly overflowing. Edward's blood. The men staggered back. Some cursed, others prayed, but all felt the same dread. She had drained him completely, as though she meant to preserve every drop. Of Agatha, there was no trace, no footprints in the mud, no broken branches in the woods. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. They heard the scream before they saw the body. A raw, tearing sound that didn't sound like a man at all, but like the earth itself splitting open. The men ran, lanterns swinging, beams of light lurching across the broken orchard. Apples lay mashed into the mud like spilled hearts. The old oak stood at the center, a black fist clawing the sky. Edward Harrison hung there, upside down, ankles bound with a cord that looked like rope, until someone raised a lantern and saw threads of something pale braided through it. "Horsehair," one man said. Another shook his head, mouth quivering. Not horsehair, the fibers were too fine, too human. Edward's throat was cut, clean as a surgeon's line, and yet the ground below was spotless. That was when Mr. Grant saw the trough, broad, wooden, used for feeding pigs, set carefully beneath him. The liquid inside reflected the lantern light with a sullen shine. The smell of iron filled the air. A fly settled on the surface and did not move again. "Don't look," one of the younger farmers muttered, as if the command could erase the sights. They lowered the body with shaking hands, cutting the cord that indented his ankles to the bone. The cord was knotted with care, 9 knots, evenly spaced. Mr. Grant counted them twice because he did not want to believe the number. 9. 3 times 3. On the bark of the oak, symbols had been carved in looping lines, as if written by a hand that never lifted its blade. Circles inside circles, a line of slashes that pointed toward the hill, and a spiral that ended in a crude drawing of a mouth with 3 long teeth. The cuts bled sap that smelled like old sugar and something sour under it. "Cover him," Mr. Grant said, voice steadier than his hands. They took off their coats and laid them across Edward's face and chest, but the fabric soaked through. The night was damp, and Edward's skin had the dull wax of candles. "Where is she?" someone asked into the dark. The orchard did not answer. The trees held their breath. No owl called, no cricket sang, and the fog clung to the ground as if it feared to rise. They found footprints near the trough, small, bare, almost delicate. They led nowhere, fading into grass and then into nothing at all, as if the person who made them had stepped into air. "Get him down," said Mr. Grant. "We're taking him home." He did not say the rest aloud, "before she comes back to take what we have taken from her." As they lifted the body, the lanterns guttered simultaneously, as if some great mouth had exhaled. When the flame steadied again, more symbols glimmered in resin on the bark, marks none of them remembered seeing before, wet, newly carved. No one dared speak it, but every man there felt the same cold thought slide behind his ribs. "We are being watched." They carried Edward down the hill in grim procession, boots sinking in mud, breath streaming like ghosts. Behind them, the trough sat in the fog, brimming, the surface untroubled as polished stone. The sheriff drove in from the next town at dawn, gravel popping beneath his tires. He had a mustache that tried to make him look older than he was, and a notepad that made him feel safer than he should. He asked questions with a voice that avoided the words everybody was thinking. Ritual? Sacrifice? Witch? He wrote the phrases people would accept. Trespass, homicide, suspect at large. But the town did not speak to him so much as around him. They spoke to each other, quietly, as though the past might overhear. In the general store, where the bell over the door still rang cheerful lies, an old woman named Ruth Whittaker began to talk. She had hair like ash and hands with veins like river maps. She did not look at the sheriff when she spoke. She looked at the hills. In 1902, men came with deeds and guns and a preacher who smiled too much. They called this place Hope's End then. I was told that name was a joke. the sort men make when they think the land is already theirs. She spoke of the river people who had lived where the orchards grew now, people who set stones in circles and sang to storms so they would pass lightly. She spoke of a girl no older than 10 who watched her mother and father fall under rifle fire and did not make a sound, because her grandmother had told her once that sound is a rope you hand to the dark. Pull on it and the dark will find you. The girl ran, Ruth said, into the trees and the caves and the places the sun doesn't keep. She didn't die there. She learned. She learned how to burn water without a flame and cool fire without smoke. She learned the names of plants that only grow where bones are close, and she learned the names of things that do not like their names spoken. Ruth's voice thinned. She came back a woman. Maybe the same girl, maybe the girl and something else wearing her like a glove. She healed the sick who were not Harrisons. She whispered into the ears of cows so milk ran again. She hung strings of bones in the hedges and the foxes kept their distance. But whenever Harrison set foot upon this valley, calves were born dead, wells soured, and a wind walked the house at night. Names? The sheriff asked, pen poised. Ruth shook her head. Names have power, she said, and the store went still as if even the walls were listening. You can call her Agatha now if you like, but names change coats, same bones beneath. Others added their pieces. In 1913, the barn burned without flame, blackened wood that never smoked. In 1927, a Harrison boy drowned in a well dry since spring. In 1939, the patriarch woke to find his teeth loosened in the night. By noon, his gums were smooth as a child's, and his speech was a wet whistle. He left that year. The last left in 1945, cursing the valley. No one from the bloodline returned. Until Edward. The sheriff wrote none of that. He wrote about tire tracks and footprints. He drew a small square to mark the trough and tried to make the square explain the fear pressed into the faces around him. He could not. At dusk, the church bell rang. Not for service, for gathering. The body was laid upon a table, candles stuttering in the drafts that came from nowhere. Margaret stood beside her husband with a face gone beyond grieving to a terrible quiet. Michael held Sarah's hand. She flinched at every shadow. Vengeance lasts as long as memory, longer sometimes, but forgetting is not forgiveness, it's permission. No one said Agatha's name. No one said Harrison either. The sheriff stood at the back and pretended not to notice. That night, the wind moved through the valley with careful feet. The sound it made was not a howl. It was a word spoken by someone with too few teeth. The burial was quick and quiet, dirt thudding, a muffled drum. Margaret did not cry at the grave. She had cried herself hollow already. When the last spade of earth fell, she pressed her palm to the mound and whispered something not even Sarah heard. It sounded like a promise or a threat made gentle by love. They left within the week. The house closed its windows like eyelids. A for sale sign went up and leaned crooked in the wind, and no one straightened it. Margaret drove the Jeep with both hands white on the wheel. Michael watched the rearview mirror as if the road behind them might rise up and walk. Sarah sat in the back seat and counted breaths. 7 in, 7 out. She had learned that in the city hospital, but the numbers did not keep the shadows from sitting beside her. In town, the priest offered a blessing. Margaret accepted because saying no felt like daring the sky. A neighbor pressed a cassette recorder into her hands, an old one with a cracked speaker. She said, "Let it run at night. Sometimes what you don't hear, it hears for you." The first night in the small apartment above a laundromat, the recorder clicked and hummed while they tried to sleep. At 3:03 a.m., the tape caught 3 sounds. Knock, knock, knock. Not on wood, on something hollow and thin, like a window pane touched with a fingernail. Then a dry, papery laugh. Michael played the tape back in the morning with his jaw locked until the muscles jumped. He said, "It's a trick," but his voice had no place to put certainty. He began sleeping with the baseball bat leaned against his bed, and once, when he woke to find it on the floor, though he swore he left it propped securely, he moved it to the closet. He never opened that closet at night again.
A week later, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a photograph, yellow around the edges. A family stood in front of a sign. The father had a mustache, like a black wing. The mother looked like Margaret might look if she swallowed her smile forever. The children were neat and unhappy. The sign said, "Harrison Farm, Hope's End." On the back, someone had written a date, 1902. And below it, in a hand too careful to be casual, "You came back." Margaret burned the photo over the sink. The smoke smelled like apples left too long on the ground. That night, at 3:03, the knocks came again. Knock, knock, knock. From inside the apartment this time. Sarah sat up in bed and did not scream. She whispered something instead, in a language she had never learned. On the cassette, the words sounded like the rustle of tall grass. In the morning, Margaret packed their bags again. "We go farther," she said. "We keep moving until the road forgets our name." No one corrected her to say that roads remember better than people do. Back in Hollow Creek, the hill watched without eyes. Agatha's house had been torn down, but the foundation stones remained like a jawline without teeth. And perhaps that was why the wind sounded different up there now, whistling through gaps as if practicing a laugh. The sheriff returned twice with men from the county, asking questions with new forms. Each time he left with cold coffee in his cup and fewer words than he brought. He stopped drawing squares on his pad. He started carrying a small bag of salt in his pocket without telling himself why. The land changed hands twice in a year. A couple from the city lasted 3 weeks. At night, the husband heard a woman walking in the yard, footsteps light as a child's. He went out with a flashlight and found prints smaller than his palm pressed into the mud. They were gone by morning, but the flashlight would not turn on again, though the batteries were new. The couple left without taking their deposit back. Teenagers came to dare each other. They filmed themselves with shaky cameras, standing under an old oak saying the forbidden name and laughing too loudly. One boy climbed the hill alone while his friends jeered. When he came down, he wasn't laughing. He kept swallowing like a man who can't get rid of a taste. That night, his mother woke to the sound of teeth chattering in the kitchen. She found him staring into the sink, his lips purple, water running over his hands that trembled, though the room was warm. He would not go near the orchard for the rest of summer. And in autumn, he left for a town with no hills. Mr. Grant began leaving offerings at the fence line, a candle in a jar, a slice of bread, an apple cut in 9 pieces.
Some shook their heads at superstition. None touched the offerings to throw them away. In the morning, the jars were always empty, the bread gone, the apple seeds set in a neat triangle on the dirt. A deputy volunteered to camp on the hill one full moon night. He brought a thermos and a book of crossword puzzles and a rifle he didn't load because he told himself this was a joke and he wanted to sleep. At 1:11 a.m., the fog rolled uphill in a line as precise as a marching band, and at 2:22 a.m., a sound like a woman humming moved around his tent without fading, as it should when the hummer walks away. At 3:03 a.m., something touched the canvas from the outside with the backs of fingers. Knock, knock, knock. He unzipped the flap and shone his right and saw nothing at all, not even the beam itself, as if the night had eaten it. In the morning, he told the sheriff that he had fallen asleep and heard nothing. He resigned before the month was out. A teacher who had moved to town for the quiet drove home one evening and saw a white shape standing in the road by the fig tree where the path forks. She slowed, braked, squinted through the windshield. The shape did not move. The teacher rolled down her window and called, "Are you all right?" The woman turned her head. The teacher did not remember driving the rest of the way home. She woke up in her driveway with the car door open and dirt under her nails, as if she had been digging. Children invented a game and did not understand. 3 knocks on a desk, 3 slow counts, then the last child to say Harrison lost. The teachers forbade the game when they realized the loser always went home sick, complaining of a cold that made their teeth ache. The hill continued to stand. The ridge kept its secrets. At night, shadows lay in long ribs across the fields, like the marks of giant fingers pressing down. When the wind came from the north, church bells in the next town rang once without a hand on the rope, and the sound felt like a question that no one wanted to answer. No one said the name after dark, not even in a whisper, not even to a mirror. Years passed the way mist burns off a field, quietly, without ceremony, but some things do not thin. In Hollow Creek, people still lock their doors on nights when the moon is whole. They still avoid the fig tree fork after sundown. They still teach their children to be careful with names. The cursed property remains untended. Grass hides the scars of the earth where bones came up to breathe, and the fence leans as if tired from holding the line between here and there. At the edge of the fence, small offerings appear: a yellow candle, a braid of grass, 9 seeds in a triangle, a cup of water that does not dew on the outside, though the nights are humid. No one claims the offerings. Everyone sees them. Travelers pass through and feel something. Nothing they can say out loud without sounding foolish. A heaviness, like a memory on the tip of the tongue. A whisper that might be wind finding a new path. A taste of iron behind the teeth. Sometimes, when the clouds move fast and the moon leaps free, someone sees her at the top of the ridge, thin as a scarecrow, dressed in white that shifts without a breeze, head tilted, listening. The valley goes quiet as if the land is holding its breath. And if you are very unlucky, if you have the wrong blood or the right name, you might hear it too. The small, brittle sound the old folk learned to fear more than thunder. The clack of 3 long teeth, patient as counting. They say her house is gone and her body with it. They say time takes everything, but the oldest among them will tell you, softly, that time only takes what it owns. The rest it carries. The rest it wears. And so, when the wind crawls through the orchards and the fog climbs the hill like careful hands, Hollow Creek stays indoors. They do not speak the name that drew blood from the earth. They do not call for what listens. They let the nights pass over them like a sail over deep water. And in the morning, they open their doors and thank the day with coffee that tastes a little of apples and a little of something else beneath. If you ever go there, do not ask for directions to the ridge. Do not follow a white dress into the trees. And if someone knocks at 3:03 a.m., 3 times, polite as a neighbor, do not answer, not even to say you are awake, because names have power, and some dead still listen. And somewhere in the darkness above the town, a mouth with 3 teeth is smiling, waiting for the sound that means you remember, the sound it loves most, the sound of bone.